Hey, so a couple of weeks ago, somebody sent me something on Patreon in regards to growth effects. And if you've seen any of my work over the last year or so, I really love procedural growth. It really kind of de-rusted the gears in my head as I haven't really been working on much YouTube stuff for the past few months, and this seemed really interesting to me. I've shown off a few different ways of simulating growth within Blender using different modifiers and different add-ons and such, but this time around I wanted to find a way to keep it entirely within Blender, no outside add-ons, and make something simple yet kind of elegant. So after a few weeks of playing around, I came up with this. Now, I'm not going to pretend that this is the most complicated, simulation of all time, but I do think it's something that can kind of get you to dip your toes into the world of simulations, as well as kind of faking some procedural growth without actually having to run such complex simulations to do so. Alright, so the basis of this effect is actually really simple. What we're going to do is start off with just the default cube. We're going to duplicate it, and then we're going to hide the second version of it. Then with our available cube, we're going to go into edit mode, we're going to go into face mode, we're going to select this, and we are going to pull up our little handy dandy, and we're just going to pull it up like this. I don't need to know the name of everything. Gizmo? Is it called a gizmo? Anyways, just pull it up till you're at a length that you think is about appropriate, something around here. Now we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna press Control A and we're gonna apply all transforms to this. Now we're gonna pull up our second cube. And we're gonna move this down till it is just a little bit below our main rectangle here. And now that we have put in all of this hard work to get our exclamation point, I can actually tell you what we're doing, and we're gonna be playing around with one of my absolute favorite functions in Blender. I've ranted and raved about how good it is for so long. And that's dynamic paint. So if we go ahead and select our main rectangle here and we come over to our physics tab, we can enable dynamic paint. We are going to add ourselves a canvas. So what is dynamic paint for those that are unfamiliar? I understand if you've been around on this channel, you might know, but if this is the first video you're ever seeing from me, what is dynamic paint? Dynamic paint in its most base form allows you to take one object and turn it into a canvas and one object and turn it into a brush. So then in a 3D space, we can paint a vertex map, a weight map, or a wet map onto an object based on its correlation with objects around it. I understand that that might sound a little bit complicated, but trust me, it is so stupidly easy. So we're gonna come back into our rectangle. We are gonna scroll down until we find the output tab down here, and we are gonna see wet map and paint map down here. But we don't actually want any of these because we don't wanna be working with paint, we wanna be working with weight. So what we can do is come up to surface type and change paint to weight. And then we will see that this changes the vertex group to dp_weight. Now it's red right now, so what we're gonna do is click this little plus sign. This is super important. Don't skip that step. If you don't click the plus sign, the whole base of this effect doesn't work. And why that is so important is because if we don't click that plus sign, then our weight group can't be animated. So if we come down here to our data tab, we can see that we have a vertex group called dp_weight. And then with our main object selected, if we go into weight paint mode, we can see that there's nothing going on here, but our brushes no longer work. And that is because we're no longer going to be painting by hand, we're going to be painting with objects, and that's what the little cube is for. So with that little cube selected, if we come over here into our simulation tab again, we select dynamic paint, but this time we make it a brush. Now for what we want to do today, we're going to come down to our source tab, we're going to change mesh volume to volume plus proximity. And the reason that we want to do that is because we get to control our fall off and how effective the fade is between our weights. So for a demonstration here, let's go ahead and put down a keyframe here on our location, and then maybe, I don't know, like frame 100, and we're gonna put our location way up here, right? Now, if we select the rectangle object and then we go back into weight paint mode, we can see something's going on here. If we press play, we can see that we have an animated weight group. But you can see as it's getting halfway through, it's got some weird stuff going on. It's not quite getting everything. And then the second it pops out the top, we go full red, right? So the reason for that weirdness is actually because this box does not have enough vertices on it. So the way that weight painting works, it is only able to assign weight to faces or vertices or edges, right? And if we look at this rectangle, there are only verts down here and up here. So we're going to need stuff in between. So what I would recommend doing is just adding a loop cut with Control R and then using your scroll wheel to add a bunch more. You don't really need to be worried about how many we're adding at this point in time because we're going to be subdividing the living hell out of this. So like adding a bunch of different verts doesn't really matter so much. So again, with our main object selected, if we come back into weight paint mode and we press play, we can see that we have a much more even effect going on. So now that you've learned the absolute basics, bare bones about weight maps, let me tell you about how you can learn a little bit more with today's sponsor, Skillshare. For the past few months, I've been reminiscing about how much I loved to draw and paint as a kid, so I bought a tablet and got to work, only to find out that taking roughly 10 years off of my hobby has made me pretty rusty. And luckily that's where Skillshare comes in. I was able to jump right into a class about the basics of anatomy and start working on all the things I've forgotten. And maybe one day I'll be able to actually draw a front-facing foot, because how are you actually supposed to do that? It's impossible. For those of you that might not know, Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives. That means if you have an interest in learning something new, you could save yourself the hassle of trying to search and collect a million different learning tools and just get ahead by using Skillshare's curated learning paths, providing you with a clear-cut direction to achieve your goals. One of the ways that Skillshare does this is by allowing you to take advantage of their on-demand platform, providing members with the ability to learn at their own pace. That means if you're like me and you go through spurts of creative energy, you can pick up a class when you have the time and put it down when you don't. Then when life settles, all of your progression is right where you left it, allowing you to fit learning into your schedule. For me, that way of learning has been super beneficial, especially when it comes to making videos. Lately, I've been exploring more of the creative planning and writing side of making videos, and as someone who really sucked at this stuff in school, it's really cool to see that Skillshare is a curated learning path centered around creative essay writing. It's definitely something I plan to take advantage of in the future, and hopefully you guys will get to see the impact that it has on my future content. And it's not just limited to creative writing. They have learning paths for 3D modeling, music production, programming, web design, and so much more. With all of that said, of course, Skillshare hooked it up for all of you as well. So the first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So get started today. Now with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get back into this. The first thing that we're going to want to do is adjust our distance here. So let's go ahead and change this to something like 3. And what this is going to allow us to see is that we are going to have a much more subtle fall off here. We can't even see the orange or the red in our weight map yet. And what that's going to allow for is just a smoother transition between our base object and the growth we are trying to put on it. So what we're going to do is move this cube down a little bit, because you could see before we were able to see just a little bit of the weights on the bottom of this. We don't want that. We want it to start 100% blue. So for the absolute beginners amongst you who have never used weight paint before, you could think of the colors within weight painting as numerical values. In the same way that when you're creating a mask, white is 1 and black is 0, meaning that black does not show and white does show. In this case, your value of blue is 0 and your value of red is 1. That means that if it is blue, we have 0% of something, and if it is red, we have 100% of something. Everywhere in between is a subtle gradient. So let's go ahead and I'm going to re-add my keyframes here, and I think I'm going to go out to about 200. I want this to be a really slow growth, and we're going to move it up till it's probably just about there, maybe. Let's go ahead and change our interpolation mode to linear. That way it's constant movement. We're going to select our main object, go back into weight paint mode. We're going to turn off our secondary cube, and we're going to let this play. And now you can see that this is already looking super, super smooth, and I think this will be good for the basis of our effect. Friendly reminder, if you have not, this is a good time to save your project. Also, it could be a good time to name our cubes. So I'm just going to call one of these brush and one of these canvas. So with our canvas selected, let's go ahead and start setting up the basics of this effect. We're going to add ourselves a subdivision surface modifier, and we're going to turn this up to 2 for now. And after that, we are going to add a displace modifier. And the displace is going to be nearly all of what is driving this effect. So we're going to come down here under the texture option. We're going to click new, and then we're going to click these little sliders here. This is going to take us down into our texture tab down here, and under image or movie, we're going to select Voronoi. So you might be opening up this tab and asking yourself, why Voronoi? You know, there's all these different options here. And that is because we can tweak this to kind of look crystally. So if we go ahead and right click shade smooth on this, we can start playing around with some of our settings. And much like when we're making our masks or when we're playing with our weight maps, we have our preview image here. And again, we're looking at black and white values, black being 0, white being 1. So anywhere that there is black, we're not going to see any displacement. Anywhere where there is white, we're going to see a lot of displacement. So, you know, try to keep that in mind as you're adjusting these settings. You have a visual for it outside of what is appearing on your screen. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to adjust the scaling of this. And you can see already here, we're getting like this kind of crystally, kind of geometric shape going on. And I like the basis for this a lot. But you can see that there's some weird overlap going on, and it's kind of breaking the mesh in a few spots, so we definitely need to fix that. So the first thing that we can do is come back into our modifiers tab and play around with our mid-level. And if we pull this back, we can see that we're kind of separating that mesh from eating itself, which generally speaking is kind of a good idea. Once you're here, you can kind of play around with your strength value as much as you want to. You can also come down in here to where your colors are and under brightness and contrast, you can kind of change things in here. Feel free to play with this as much as you want to, right? If you're looking at this and you're like, the Verona doesn't look good, maybe you want to switch it up to magic or, clouds or something, right? Go for whatever looks good to you, because this part of the effect is totally subjective. And if it's just like what you want the thing to look like, that's totally up to you. You don't have to like stick to me 100% on this part. All right, so these are the settings here that I am choosing to go with, as well as the settings under our modifiers tab. But if you go ahead and press play, you'll notice that this isn't animated, and that's because we need to select our vertex group, dp_weight. And once we select that, we can see our effect immediately goes away. If we press play, there it is. Our immediate growth effect is basically here already. This is the basis of the effect. Now, something we should do before we move forward is bake our dynamic paint. But something to keep in mind when you bake your dynamic paint is baking to your current geometry. So if we go into edit mode, we can see all of the faces that we made earlier, all of those extroverts and everything. If we want to add anything to this, we're always going to have to rebake our dynamic paint because it is based off of our initial mesh. Just something to keep in mind. Not a huge problem, but just, be aware of it. For me, I think I'm good, so I'm going to go ahead and click bake, and you should see that this should take basically no time at all, provided that your mesh isn't crazy dense. Now, if you're still not totally satisfied with the look of this, you can add another displace modifier. You go ahead and come down to the texture, click new, but this time make sure you're clicking this little pages icon here. This ensures that once we go over and click on our sliders tab over here, we're not adjusting the old texture. It's a brand new texture, so we can go ahead and we can select, noise if we want to select noise, which is interesting. Let's say I wanted to select something like wood and get these weird like ring shapes in here. We can go ahead and select that. We can turn our effect way down, right? Maybe something like 0.1, just so we're getting a little bit of extra wave in here. If we select our vertex group again, you can see that it's only affecting the same areas. And you can kind of do this as much as you want to create as distorted of a look as you want. So you might have noticed in the thumbnail that we had a little bit more growth going on than what I've shown you guys here. We've got this little bit of like bumpy, scaly orb thing kind of going on in our object. Now what's up with that? And to be honest, that is even easier than what we just set up. All it is a particle system. So if we go ahead and add a particle system, set this guy to hair, we can spawn ourselves in a sphere, or if your computer can kind of take it, I would recommend the meta balls. So this is something interesting that I've not seen a lot of people play around with, is that you can instance meta balls via a particle system, and they work as meta balls. So if we come down here to our render tab and we change from path to object, take our little eyedropper tool and select the meta ball, we can see that they are just kind of growing along the edge of this. But it's kind of making a huge mess right now. So something we can do is we could scale down the initial meta ball, and we could find that we can create little patterns and things like this, where each meta ball that touches each other kind of grows into the one next to it, and it creates kind of an interesting effect. But again, we want this to grow with our displacement, right? We don't want them to just appear on the object. So if we come down to vertex group and we select length and then select our vertex group again, and then play this back, you can see it's much slower right now because we're using the meta balls, but you can see they are popping in with our displacement. Now, let's be honest, the meta balls kind of, they kind of look really bad. So if we select our initial meta ball and then we come down to the meta ball data tab, we have our resolution. So we have viewport and render. Now, what we're going to want to do is probably come down to something like 0.1 or maybe even smaller. And you can see that this is already looking much better. It's a little bit too round, which is kind of the problem with meta balls. You can select other objects to use. They have the pill, the plane, the ellipsoid. There are other objects you could choose. It's just part of the problem with meta balls. They're not quite like complex enough. And unfortunately, if you duplicate the meta ball and kind of like do this, try to make a shape out of it, at this point, it doesn't work like that because it counts the particle system as the same object as the initial meta ball. And that's just kind of how they work. But I do think that it can create a very interesting effect. But again, at this point, this is where things start getting heavy. So if you're not able to run this on your system, you can obviously just use a regular sphere or a rounded cube, whatever you want to be using to kind of get these little pearls, these little growths, whatever you want to call them. Now, in my initial render of this project in motion, you can see that I'm just using regular spheres and there's not that many of them. But then as I played around with the effect for the thumbnail, I wanted to get something a little bit more complex and a little bit more striking, especially since I was only going to be doing a still. I wasn't really worried about how heavy the project was going to be because I was only going to render the one frame. Because of that, I went into my particle system and I changed this to something around 5,000. I scaled our meta ball down pretty small so that they were interacting with each other in kind of a better light. We have less perfect spheres, more of little squiggles that are interacting with each other. And I think that looks pretty good. But right now it's a little bit too uniform for my taste. So how we can fix this is if we come down to our weight groups with our rectangle selected, we can add another weight group. Now with our second weight group selected, we can just go ahead and call this paint. And we're going to come over here back into weight paint mode. And this one, we're going to be able to paint with our brush. So something that I did is I turned my radius up and my weight down like this. And I kind of stayed like a decent distance away from my object. And I just kind of added in little dots, right? Keeping a little bit of separation and a little bit of place for some negative space, because I think that's going to be really important to our effect. And the reason that we're creating this is to kind of break up some of the particles. So if we come down here to our vertex group and under density, if we select paint, now when our particles are growing back in, they will only grow in the areas that we selected. So you can see that it is not quite as uniform. There are random growths all over. This also helps with the balls kind of growing into each other. So right now, I think at this moment, with the way this object is laid out, because it's going to be different for all of you, I think mine currently has too many particles on it at the moment. So I'm going to cut this in half and go down to 2500, just something like this. And I might even scale our metal ball down even further, just so it's something like that. And then I think I'm actually going to add a secondary particle system, this one with just a regular UV sphere. So with this secondary particle system, it really wasn't anything crazy. I just wanted to add a little bit more breakup. So with the regular sphere, you make it hair, then you add all of your weight groups to it, just so that you're making sure it actually works with our effect. From there, I turned the number up to like 5,000, I think, and then I played with the seed just so that there was a little bit more breakup and kind of implying that there is more detail going on than there actually is. After that, I just set up a very basic backlight system so that we could start working on our materials. Now, as far as materials go, we're actually going to do something kind of interesting. We want to highlight the kind of cracks and crevices within our object. So what we're going to do is we're going to get ourselves an ambient occlusion node, and we're going to get ourselves a color ramp node. And we're going to plug the color from our ambient occlusion into the factor. Now for the time being, just drop like a sun into your scene, and we're going to point it at our rectangle just so we can see a little bit better, because the ambient occlusion node doesn't actually show up in material view. It will only show up in object view. Object view, render view. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about today. Now with our color ramp selected, we can go ahead and plug this into our output, and we can adjust our handles here to see that we are starting to get some of that effect where we can see the ridges in our object, right, where our displacement is. But it's not quite apparent enough, so let's go ahead and do a couple of things real quick. So let's go ahead and drop in a mix color node, and we're going to plug our color from our color ramp into the A value, then make ourselves a map range node, a noise texture, and then we are going to make ourselves a little mapping and texture coordinate by pressing Control T while we have Node Wrangler enabled. If you don't have Node Wrangler enabled, you can come up here to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and then type in Node Wrangler. I would really recommend using it. It's very helpful. So let's go ahead and plug our factor into our top value of our map range, the bottom, the result into our B value of our mix color. And now let's plug that into our output and go back into rendered view. So what's going on here is that our ambient occlusion is falling on our object. So the areas that are going to be lit up are our edges, which we want again to be a numerical value. So it's going to be, 1 or 0. This time we're going to go with 1. So it's going to be white. And then the insides of each of those little geometric shapes is going to be darker. So we want that to be somewhere closer to 0. Now this section here, this is just so that we can add a little bit of noise and a little bit of breakup so that it's not completely uniform between the edges of the black and white areas. And our map range is essentially going to affect how contrasted the image is. So if we come all the way down here to like 200 where our effect is finished, we get to see the full scale of everything here. And we're going to play around with our values here a little bit. Now, ideally, I would like the centers of our objects to be pretty dark. And then I would like those lines on the outside to be pretty defined. Now, something else that we can do is change our texture coordinate from generated to object, and then we can increase our noise a little bit to kind of get a little bit more breakup in there if we wanted. And now if we come down here and we adjust our values again through our color ramp node, we can get them pretty tight. So now what we have here with our effect is essentially going to be a mask for a mix shader. So we drop in our mix shader, we duplicate our principled BSDF. We're going to put these both in here. We're going to take our result of our mix color, plug that into the factor of our mix shader, and then put this here. And now you can see we're both white, but let's go ahead and change this down to black. And you'll see that that acts as a mask between the two materials that we're going to use. So let's go ahead and set this top one to something in our blue range, maybe something around here. We're going to turn our roughness all the way down, turn our transmission up to something like this. And then for this shader, we are going to turn this to black. So to get our effect that we're looking for, we're gonna go ahead and turn our roughness up to something like 0.5 on our blue material. And then we're gonna switch these around. I have them in the wrong order. We want our black material to be on top. And you can see that that's already made a big difference in how this is laying out. We can take our multiply node and turn our factor to something like 0. Then come back up here to our color ramp and kind of adjust some of the scaling a little bit more. Just so we've got like some harsher cutoffs and things. We can go ahead and play around with our roughness and things a little bit more. We find you're not quite looking exactly how you want to. So at this point in the tutorial, while I was recording, there was actually some loud construction happening right outside my apartment. So I'm just gonna kind of do some voiceover here real quick. The basics of what I was covering is I was unhappy with the look of everything as it was. So I wanted to go in and adjust the colors a little bit, make sure that it was a little bit closer to ice. And I felt like it was just too blue before. I also adjusted the breakup value, so you know, the black versus the light blue. That way we could get like the contrast and the effect that we were actually going for. Again, because you modeled your own object, this is going to be one of those things that you have to play around with in just adjusting your color ramp and adjusting your mapping node to make sure that everything is lining up how you want it to line up and what looks good for your personal project. From there, I threw a very simple glass material onto our particles, both the metaball and just the regular sphere. I added a little side light just to give some better reflections off of those balls because I felt like they were a little bit too dark and that just made it look a little bit nicer. I also rescaled our object just so that it's a little bit thinner so that more light can pass through it. And don't worry about your dynamic paint. You absolutely don't have to resim it if you're just scaling because we're not adding any new mesh. I also rotated it a little bit just so that it plays with the light a little bit better. I thought that it looked much, much nicer. So after playing around a little bit, this is what I have landed on. And the things I have changed, I've come into our particle system that has our metaballs, and I've turned up the scale randomness to 1. I've also played around with the seed just to find a seed that I like. So this way there's like a little bit less going on. I think it adds like a little bit more of a natural growth feel. It doesn't feel so like man-made and produced by a machine, you know? I also changed my displacement settings. I'm only using the one displacement texture, the Voronoi texture here. You can see my settings for that here, as well as the settings that I used within the actual add-on. I rotated our object a little bit just to give ourselves a little bit of breakup so we're not looking at it head on. I also think that helps with the lighting. I added a little side light here, and I think that that kind of helps wrap the effect up. Now, the last thing I did in the initial render was I animated our light value moving up like this so that we got kind of a reveal effect along the black background. I believe I also messed around with the ambient occlusion value here, the distance. I think in the initial render, I changed it so that it was like pure black. And then I animated it over time so that it came back to what it was supposed to be, kind of like this. So it was fading in over time. So for this instance, I would probably turn this up to something like 1.6 or maybe even, you know, like 1.8. And I would place a keyframe over here, and then I would come down to 200 and I'd move it back to where we were. That way it kind of helps with the reveal of like, you know, it's coming up out of nowhere from the background, you know? But yeah, there is our basic kind of ice growth effect. Obviously, this could be applied to so many different things, but this is just kind of the base stepping stone. If you are interested in this stuff, I'd recommend playing around, and like pretty much every modifier in Blender, you can enable the vertex like group selection. So you could really mix and match this kind of like fading in with the paint with pretty much anything. So thank you so much for watching all the way to here. I want to say thank you to the people on Patreon who've been supporting me. Even over the last 7 months, there's still like 50 people over there that are following me, something like that. And that's crazy because like I haven't really been posting over there. There's only been a few things that have gone up. I've just been so swamped with work and life and stuff that I haven't really been focusing on YouTube. You know, I focus on like my full-time job and family, you know, whatever. So I really appreciate the support over there. Thank you to them so much. If you want the project file for the thumbnail version of this project, that'll be up on my Patreon already once this video goes live. And yeah, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you again real soon.